is Lindsay, and today we are going to be talking about waiting on the promise of God. Now, most of you will have seen the video that I put out last week about waiting for kingdom marriages and like the frustration that comes along with that a lot of the time, and it was really like a real kind of chat about like my process that I've been going through and that I know a lot of you guys have been going through as well, with the whole ups and downs of all of this. And I was just reminded today about the story of Hannah, Samuel's mum in the Bible. And we're going to be turning to 1 Samuel chapter 1, where it talks about Hannah. She's going through this whole emotional process of really wanting a baby, really wanting a baby boy, and how she got to the point where she trusted God and eventually she had Samuel and her prayer was answered and God came through on his promise to her. So let's go there and I'll give you some little explanation points along the way. So we're looking in 1 Samuel chapter 1, and it starts out by talking about there's this guy, his name is, where is he? Elkanah, the son of all these random guys. He had 2 wives. Now let's pause there. So we're in verse 2 now. So this guy, he is an Israelite. He lives in the tribe of Ephraim. It's kind of like in the central part of Israel. And the fact that he has 2 wives tells us a little bit about his financial standing. So back in those days, marriages weren't so much about a love relationship between a man and a woman. They were more of an economic contract between 2 families. And basically, if a man could economically support more than 1 wife, he was free to have more than 1 wife. Now, obviously, we believe as Christians that we should have 1 man and 1 woman, and that is a marriage. There shouldn't be more people involved, and that is obviously the Edenic model that God has given us with Adam and Eve. He gave us a man and a woman. That's our grandparents, and that's the way we're supposed to be doing marriage forever and ever. However, back in the ancient Near East, their culture dictated that, like, we know from statistics from today that there's about 51% of the population is women and 49% is a man. And because of this 1% difference, or 2% difference actually, that means that there's, more women than men. And women, especially in those times, were not usually able to economically support themselves. In some cultures, they were more able to, like in Egypt, but in places like Canaan, they really weren't. It was a male-dominated economic society, and if a woman did not have a man in her life, whether it was her father, her husband, or her son, then she was at the lowest rung of society and she was not able to really support herself, and so she was basically considered destitute. So it was actually important for women to be married to a man so that they could survive. And in a lot of cases, and this still happens in some countries today, there's not enough men to go around. And so because of that, often 1 man would have more than 1 wife. And sometimes it was just 2 wives, sometimes it was like hundreds of wives if he was the king, and anywhere in between, just depending on your economic standing, basically. How many people can you support? How many wives and children can you support? Well, that kind of dictates how many wives you're going to marry and how many children you're hopefully going to be limited to. So that already tells us that Elkanah was well off enough to have more than 1 wife to be able to support. And his second wife, Peninnah, she had children, but we're told that Hannah didn't have any kids. And as we read, we see that this man was also a godly man. So every single year he went up to the temple to make sacrifices and to be like participating in the feasts. And he did this every single year without fail. And when they were at these feasts, they would have a roast lamb, basically. It would be part of the sacrifice itself, and then they would roast it and eat it. And a particular feasts, they would roast it, they would eat it. The head of the household would carve it up, different pieces of it, depending on how good each piece of meat was considered, it would be given to different people in the family. And so if it was a very nice, tender, juicy piece of meat, it would go to the most honorable person or the person that was most favored in the family. And if it was just like an average piece of meat, it would go to like less honorable people in the family, or just people, you know, who were not as high up in the social ladder in the family. And so we are told here that Elkanah would carve up the meat and he would give a piece to his wife and to his wife's children. So this is Peninnah and her children. He would just give them an average piece each. But to Hannah, he would give a double portion, a really good piece of meat, a good size as well, because he loved her. He actually had more interest and attention and affection for Hannah, even though she didn't have any children. So despite the fact that she had no children, she was his favorite. And you know what? Because she was his favorite, Peninnah hated that, and so she did whatever she could to rub it into Hannah's face that Hannah didn't have any children. And the thing about having children back in those days was, for a woman, that was the thing that you needed to do in life to fulfill your calling as a woman. The whole society and the whole idea of the afterlife really was to produce descendants who would carry your name, who would remember your name. And so once you die, your children would remember your name, you would live on forever in somebody's memory, and your legacy would continue down the eons, basically. And so for a man, it was important that he have a son, at least one son, to carry on his name, to carry on his livelihood and his legacy. And for a woman, her major part of her identity was being able to produce a male heir for her husband, and that would make her feel like, hey, I'm actually doing my part in this thing that is bigger than myself, bigger than this current life right here. This is a part of my husband's legacy, and I can contribute to that by producing a son for him. And so when Hannah had no children, let alone no sons, it was the worst thing ever. And then for her to have a sister wife, basically, who was rubbing it in constantly every single year, this was so horrible and just so in her face all the time, and she wasn't able to get past this idea. And for her, it was a very legitimate part of her culture, her society, and just the way that she thought that she needed a son. It was a basic psychological need for her. It wasn't just something superfluous like we think of children sometimes today. I really hope you don't think that about children, but some people don't think that it's necessary to have children. I have close relatives who don't want to have children. I have multiple close relatives who don't want to have children. Because today we don't see a need. We see this world as a difficult kind of place, and we don't really want to have to deal with difficult children and then bringing them up and letting them loose into a difficult world. But back in those days, it was so important for a person's identity and for their legacy and afterlife for them to have a child, and a male child, to continue their line. And so for Hannah, it was just the end of the world that she was not able to conceive, and for years and years and years this was going on. So I could imagine her, being in her 30s, which in those days the life expectancy was not much past your 30. It was like maybe 40 or 50 if you were lucky for the average person. So she's going on for years and years, like being married in her teen years, probably early teens. As soon as she could technically start having kids, she would have been married off. So around the age of 13, 14 years old, she would have been married, and then for years, probably 10, 15 years later, at the age of 30 maybe, she's feeling, like, I'm a failure at life. I'm not able to produce a child. And then not only is she in that position, but she can't be at peace with that because she's got this other woman in her ear all the time, harassing her and rubbing it in her face and saying, hey, look, I've got all of these kids and you got none. Like, just telling her that you're a failure constantly. So we see that every year they went up, they had this feast, you know, Hannah would get the double portion and the favoritism from her husband, and her sister wife would harass her and make her so miserable to the point that she would cry every single time. And at this one time, Elkanah, her husband, said to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Like, isn't it enough that you're just married to me? Like, you know, I love you just the way you are. You don't need to have sons for me. And aren't I providing for you, you know, better than 10 sons ever could? Like, I'm giving you all your material needs. I'm giving you all this love and extra attention and affection. Like, you are my favorite. Isn't that enough for you?" And for her, it just wasn't. It wasn't meeting her needs. And so Hannah arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord, and she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head." And that basically says that he's going to be a Nazirite. He's going to be completely dedicated to the Lord. And yeah, if you give me a son, I'll give him right back to you. No hesitation. And it happened as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah spoke in her heart, so her mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out. Only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you. Like, this is a feast of God. What are you doing? Stop being drunk. Like, go sort yourself out." But Hannah answered and said, "No, my lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord." So she's saying here that I'm not drunk. I'm actually just talking to God directly. I'm telling him exactly how I'm feeling. That's all it is. I'm just being real with God here. "Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now." Then Eli answered and said, "All right then, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him." Now Eli didn't ask. Eli didn't really care. Eli was not the greatest guy, even though he was the high priest, and we can see that in other stories where it tells us that he and his sons particularly, and the fact that he didn't keep his sons in line, he wasn't really a great guy himself either, and God ended up judging him for his lack of restraint over his own sons. So Eli's not a really great dude, but he's the priest, and he's therefore the spokesman of God, and he doesn't really care what this woman wants from God. He just says, "All right then, whatever it is that you've asked, let God do it." And he had the actual power and the authority to say yes or no to what a person asks from God. And he's like, "Okay, I'll bless that, or I'll curse that. You can't have that, or you can have that." And so he, as the high priest, had a measure of authority to actually speak into that situation. He didn't care. He didn't know. He just said, "Sure, okay, go for it, whatever. Whatever you want, let God give it to you. Cool." And so he said, "Go in peace. Let God grant your petition, what you have asked for him." And she said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." She said, "Thank you. Thank you for, basically saying that." So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So that one thing that Eli, the not so great kind of priest guy, said, it put her at peace. Like, she had poured out her heart to God. She was crying. She was like, "God, this is exactly how I'm feeling. Could you please just remember me? Like, don't forget that I exist here." And she and her husband are devout followers of God. They go to worship every year. She has this relationship with God, and she's been praying for years and wanting this for years. And now that Eli has spoken into it and said, "Yep, sure, whatever you want, it's going to happen now," she trusted that completely, and she was at peace. And she was like, "Okay, well, the spokesperson of God has just said that I'm going to get this thing that I've asked from God, which is a son." she's no longer sad. She's got her emotional need met, even though she's not yet holding her son in her arms. She knows that God has answered her prayer and that when he's ready, she's going to get this son. And so she was no longer sad, and they arose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord and returned and came home to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And that basically means, when it says he knew his wife, that basically means they just had regular intercourse. And so in verse 20, it says, "And so it came to pass in the process of time that Hannah conceived and bore a son." So where it says in the process of time, now this isn't like, next week she conceived. When the term the process of time is used in the Bible, typically it actually means many years later this happened. So from the context of the other verses that we see this phrase used, it's not a quick turnaround. It's actually a very slow, long, drawn-out process where, in the process of time, it's years and years later. And yet at this, what we see here is no indication that Hannah was upset and going back and crying and, asking God, why isn't it happening yet? Or, is it gonna happen this year? Like every year, they went back, they did the regular thing, and we never see any mention of her crying or being upset ever again. It says she was no longer sad, and that's the end of it. She trusted in God. She placed her trust in what God said through Eli, and she completely rested in that position. She didn't beg him. She didn't cry at the altar anymore. She didn't, have any depression. She wasn't fazed by Penina harassing her any longer. She was just like, okay, cool. Well, God said that I'm going to have a kid and it's going to happen. And years go past, and we don't see any indication of her having any issue or any faltering faith or anything. It was just a direct, complete faith in what God said and waiting expectantly for that to take place. And so I find this really encouraging because it shows us an example of the way that we should approach God. In this day and age, we've got technology that makes everything super quick. We have Uber Eats, we have, all sorts of different things where we expect, the answers to our promises from God to happen so quickly. We expect everything to happen immediately, and we don't have a measure of patience about us at the moment. We have actually very, very small attention spans that are getting smaller and smaller as we consume more and more media that it has like a lot more quick images and different things like this. And so we have actually trained our brains in this 21st century to expect things to move so quickly. That didn't happen in the Old Testament times or any time before like 50 years ago, really. And now we are just experiencing things at a very, very accelerated speed. But back in those days, if God said something's going to happen, he may very well take 25 years to get around to it, just like he did with Abraham and Sarah promising them a son in the same kind of way. He said, yep, you guys are going to have an heir, and yeah, that's what I've said, that's what's going to happen. And yet 25 years later, they finally had a child, one mishap later with Hagar and Ishmael. And in this case, we don't know how long it took for Hannah to have a child, but we do see from context, literary context here, that it would have been years, and she seemed fine in the waiting as well. There may have been a moment here or there, but not a huge enough one for it to be made mention in the Bible that, she was, fluctuating in her faith or anything. No, we just see her going about her life, being Elkanah's favorite wife and doing her thing. And then she had a son. And then you know what? She had like 5 or 6 more kids after that. She conceived a son and called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked for him from the Lord. And then, a few years later, after she weaned him, so maybe at the age of like 5 years old, they weaned their kids slow back in those days, she took her little 5 or 6-year-old boy to the tabernacle and gave him to Eli to look after for the rest of his life. And she said, "Oh my Lord," so she's now talking to Eli, this is years later. She said, "Oh my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood by you here, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, which I asked of him. Therefore I also have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord." So they worshiped the Lord there. And then she prayed and she rejoiced, and yeah, she was just really joyful and happy and had this full-on song come out of her in her rejoicing that her promise was kept by God. And she's had these 5 or 6 years to cuddle up with her little baby boy, and now she's giving him back to God. And yeah, she's just really, really happy. In the end, when God makes us a promise, we can trust him. He will come through on his promise, whether it takes 25 years or whether it takes, a couple of days or a couple of months. No matter how long God's time period is, if he says something is going to happen, it's going to happen. And you just need to trust that. And it's not necessary to be going around, begging God and reminding him, "Hey God, you said this thing. Don't you remember? How come it hasn't happened yet?" Like, there's no need for all of this extra anxiety and distraught emotions to be constantly reminding God or harassing God and saying, "Hey, can you hurry up already?" When we trust God with a promise, when God has given us a promise, he will keep that promise. Absolutely. That is who he is. That's the kind of God that we serve. If you serve another God that doesn't keep his promises, then we're not talking about the same one here. If God has made you a promise, it will happen. You just need to trust him and just wait patiently in his timing, basically. I know this can sound easier said than done. I know I've gone up and down, but honestly, it's just a measure of our own faith, of how much emotional energy that we go into in the waiting process. I would love to be able to be like Hannah, where she's gone through a lot in her life and really wants this thing, really needs this thing from God. And when God says, "Yep, it's gonna happen," that she just completely said, "Cool, all right, I'm gonna go about my life now, and I'll just wait expectantly and patiently for God to come through on it," and no longer be moved emotionally to like the extremes. And so yeah, I just want to encourage you guys, because I know that in this waiting process for our future spouses especially, or for whatever it is that God has promised you, this doesn't just apply to kingdom marriages. Obviously this applied to God providing a child for Hannah, and it can apply to any other situation. If God has promised you a promotion at work, or has promised you a house that he's going to give you, or has promised you a ministry, whatever it is, God's going to do that, and he's going to provide for it, and he's going to do it in his own perfect timing. And in the meantime, it's really important for us to just learn to rest in that and learn to take joy in the waiting, and to live our lives in relationship with God, continuing to be in contact with him, but not harassing him, not going, "Hey, when's it going to happen?" Just to rest. Because if we are harassing God, now this is something that basically all the religions back in those days, other than the Israelite religion, were about. Basically every other nation in the whole world that we know of, their religions were based around power, money, and sex. That's it. There were ritual prostitutes in their temples. It was all about money, and it was all about dominating over other people or other nations. Like, their gods were there to provide them with their material needs, whether it was rain for the crops, or whether it was sunshine, or whether it was prosperity, or, proving that their God was better because they were able to take over other nations in war times, and saying, "My God is bigger and stronger because we were able to wipe out you guys." And so everything that the people did in those other religions was in order to twist the arms of their gods in their own personal favor. They were trying to manipulate God. That's what their sacrifices were about. Their sacrifices of animals or humans, a lot of the time, were about saying, "Hey God, we're going to give these things to you sacrificially so that you do what we ask because we're showing our devotion to you. But really it was a type of manipulation that they were attempting to have over their God. And yet what we see here with the Israelite God, or the Christian God here, is that when God asks for our sacrifices, it's not about manipulating him. It's pointing to Jesus, and now we don't need to do any more sacrifices because Jesus has come for us and died and was the thing that, you know, those sacrifices were pointing towards. But our worship and our sacrifice is truly more about our personal relationship with God and our devotion and our love and, yeah, our interaction with God in a family kind of way. And so, yeah, what we see here is not Hannah trying to manipulate God by praying more, by crying in front of the altar or anything like that. She had a close enough relationship with God that she was able to fully trust that what God's word, you know, it was going to come true, and that she didn't have to try to manipulate him, that she could just fully trust that he was going to come through on his promises, and so she could go about her life in peace. So if you personally have the feeling that you need to do more, you need to fast more, you need to give more tithes or offerings, or you need to do anything particularly for God's promises to come true in your life, sooner, quicker, now, whatever, then that is actually coming from a place of you personally trying to manipulate God. That's plain and simple what that is. So if you feel like you're been doing that in any kind of way, I would really urge you to repent of that and chat to God and say, hey, how can I trust you without trying to manipulate you? Because no doubt about it, if you're trying to manipulate God, you're likely trying to manipulate the other people around you. Subconsciously, it happens. So yeah, if you're trying to manipulate God, this is your wake-up call to stop doing that and just to learn to rest in his promises and his faithfulness, because God is faithful. That is who he is. We don't need to be going around trying to manipulate him. And doing so is actually like a slap in the face to God. It's saying, hey God, I don't trust you. I don't trust that you want to do this. I don't trust that you will or you can necessarily do this. I want to give more of myself and pay for the promises that you want to give to me because I want to have some sense of control in the situation. So we need to really wind that back and say, I'm sorry for trying to manipulate you, God. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to trust you for you. Trust you that you're going to do what you said, and that I can have this peace in knowing that you are faithful and that you are good and that your promises are true and that I don't have to try to twist your arm to make it happen. So yeah, that is what I wanted to share with you guys today. I hope it helped, and I'd love to hear from you what you got from this. And if you think that there is somebody in your life that you know who needs to hear this message, I would love for you to share it with them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and click the notification bell and you will hear from me again next Friday. Bye guys!